Blessings, everyone. Thank you for joining me. And it's a real honor today to have as my guest. And he's been here before, uh, Gene Gomulka. Whenever I have Gene on my podcast, people always write to me and ask me when he's going to come back. 'Cause I would say you get like the most views of any
Thanks.
of my guests. So it's very good to have you here. Now, I encourage people to subscribe to Gene's work because he sends out emails when he posts new articles, and that's how I keep up to date with what he's doing. And I want to talk about two articles that he's written recently. He's a pretty prolific writer. And then one really caught my attention. It was called the Consequences of Forced Celibacy, and this is from September 23rd, 2024. What really got me interested in it is that he goes through, and I want to go through the article, is he goes through sort of the history of the Uniate Church in the United States and the problems that they had with the Vatican in terms of the married priesthood and also electing their own bishops. Now, the Uniate Church, for lack of a better word, is the what's often referred to as Latin Eastern Rite Catholics or Byzantine Catholics. So I'll use the word union. I know they don't like it so much, but for yeah, ease. So thank you, Gene, for joining me.
My pleasure. I wrote that article beginning, wow, it was as early as 2008. I started
Wow.
writing that. And it was just recently now that I actually published it.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Now you start out, you're very good. I come from a history background, so I like the way you write because you give background and you give historical context, which I really need. So this is a good article for people because I really knew, although I'm Orthodox, I mean, I was born and raised Roman Catholic, Latin, right? And then I converted to Russian Orthodoxy 2 years ago. I didn't know anything about this history, and I think a lot of probably Catholics don't either. So this will be a good, I think, introduction because I didn't know anything and I learned a lot. So Gene starts in the article talking about the celibate priesthood in the Latin Rite, which in at least in Europe in the West has been taken over by homosexuals, and then you say in Africa and Asia, it's mostly heterosexual priests. But to what degree are these priests actually celibate? I think you rightly call that into question.
Uh, well, you have to understand, Joseph, that what I write, you will basically not find in a lot of other places because right now, because especially in the United States,
Mhm.
because the percentage of straight priests, heterosexually oriented priests, is so low today. Uh, and because of that, uh, you're not going to have a priest in ministry today who's going to give you this heterosexual perspective. And so if you're a homosexual priest, the most part, you're living in the closet and you don't want people to know your background. And so that is why you're not going to be addressing a lot of the things that I address, in my writing.
Right, exactly. I love to do slides just because I'm a visual person. You'll probably be familiar with this. So this is um, a study from 2013, Roman Catholic gay priests internalize homophobia, yeah, sexual identity, and psychological well-being. Um, of these priests identified as gay and homosexual, 67.3% of U.S. Catholic priests. That's now. What was the Richard Sype gave an estimate. What was his? 30?
Well, you see, when Richard did his research,
Yeah.
you know, he was at the same time relying upon a lot of the statistics and data that he was receiving from the bishops,
Yep.
And a lot of that, of course, was underreported. And one of the flaws is that if you are straight, as Richard was, okay, uh, if you're straight, you don't know ordinarily who the homosexual priests are. It's like a homosexual priest would know who the other homosexual priests are. So, for example, Joseph, when I lived here in State College almost 50 years ago, working in a parish, I worked with two younger priests like myself, because we had three in the parish, the pastor and two young priests. And each of those two young priests that I worked with were homosexuals who were basically groomed during their period of psychosexual development in the minor seminary. And then while I was serving with them, I did not realize that they were hitting on my altar boys. This only came out years later. They have since been removed from ministry, but because I was straight, my point is I was straight, so I didn't know who the gay priests were. They did. So if I want to know right now, for example, what the real percentage is, I'm not going to ask a straight priest because he doesn't know who the gay priests are. I'm going to ask a gay priest. And I did that recently in Indianapolis, Indiana. I can't give you the priest's name. Now, when I shared these statistics that you read there on the screen, which comes out to when you take the gay priests and the bisexual priest, you get about, almost around 75%, right?
Wow.
Now, remember, this is an older study. Today, because the number of homosexually oriented priests has increased since that time, when I asked him, I said, Father, what do you think the percentage of gay versus straight priests are in the Indianapolis Archdiocese today? You know what he said?
No.
He said, I would say they're probably maybe about 5% that are still straight.
Wow.
Now, remember, that's like 20%, less than what this report, revealed. So I would say, if you're asking me, what the percentage is in most dioceses, I would say today, based on the reports, especially from the gay priest who know better than the straight priest, I would estimate that between 5 and 15% of priests today, native-born priests, are straight. Now, you have to understand a lot of dioceses like Los Angeles, Richmond, most dioceses today, at least almost half the priests are foreign born.
Yeah.
And those priests who are coming from Africa
and
Asia are predominantly straight.
Yeah.
So the statistics I'm providing you here about, the 5 to 15%, I'm not talking about the foreign born priests. I'm talking about the native born American priest. So the point is that you are getting very, very, very few native born priests who are straight today entering the seminary and being ordained.
I agree. This topic hit me very personally because I showed up on the doorstep of the Catholic Church in San Francisco, California. And I mean, I noticed, although I had been raised Catholic and in San Francisco and abused as a boy, I hadn't been in contact with the Catholic Church for many, many years. And I mean, I noticed right away that they were predominantly gay and even predatory. So it's anecdotal evidence, but I can concur that this number is probably low, as you say.
Well, it is anecdotal. If you were to take, somebody dropped off a cassette tape to me, which was made by Mark Brooks.
Mm,
And Mark Brooks was in the Marine Corps, and then he went into when he got out of the Marine Corps after about 8 years, he entered the seminary in San Diego, where he was drugged and sodomized by Father Nick Reveles. Now, with regard to San Francisco, he wrote in his report that before he's dead now, like a lot of abuse victims, they don't live long, because they suffer from depression, sometimes alcoholism, drug addiction, so
yep.
forth, suicide. Uh, but he only lived to, I think he died around 50, 53, somewhere in there, maybe
Mm,
56 the most.
God rest
But
his soul.
anyhow, he recounted how when he went to confront his abuser, Father Nick Reveles, at his home with him at the time was San Francisco Archbishop John Quinn. And
Hmm.
he recounted in his report how he caught them watching porn videos
Oh yeah.
in Reveles' home. So when you talk about San Francisco and the number of homosexuals in the clergy, uh, it's I also have reports, from priests who can support that data.
And it hasn't changed.
No,
Although,
it won't. It won't change because straight priests motivate straight guys to become priests. Gay priests motivate gay guys to become priests.
yeah, and Archbishop Corleone is kind of like seen as like a hero in the traditional Catholic community. That's all smoke and mirrors. I mean, nothing has changed, and if anything, I think it's gotten worse because they certainly have him where they want him.
Yeah.
So let's see. So I mean, I put together just a bunch of pictures because it's kind of like, why is the Catholic Church so obsessed with homosexuality? Well, because the majority of the priests and the prelates are gay. So
Yes.
of course they're going to be obsessed with it, and here we go. Blessings of gay couples. Yeah. You can't believe the way that the Catholics, including traditional minded Catholics, twist their brains around to justify this, but they do. Lots of gay stuff. More gay, more gay, more gay, lots of gay. I wanted to make an argument real quick because I really liked this book. I don't know if you're familiar with it. I think she's in your neck of the woods. She's a Diane Ellett. She's a professor of humanities at Northwestern University. And she wrote this book called The Corrupter of Boys, Sodomy Scandal, and the Medieval Clergy. And I read it a couple of years ago. And I mean, including your writing, it really formed kind of my ideas about the Catholic Church because as a traditionally minded Catholic, I had always heard kind of the propaganda that, before Vatican II, before, Bella Dodd supposedly introduced, all these homosexuals into the Catholic Church, this wasn't a problem in Catholicism. Homosexuality, predation, all of this stuff with young boys wasn't an issue, and nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, it goes back really to the foundation of the church in 1054 when they split from the East. And this goes to your article. I started out at UC Berkeley in the art history department, and I was really interested in medieval art. And I saw this sculpture. It's from Vézelay in France. And this is from around the time of the schism. And it shows the rape of Ganymede, which was a Greek mythology, where Zeus takes his form of a bird and rapes a little boy. And here it's in a Catholic church, Romanesque. Here we've got the flagellants in France, this sort of strange, what do you call it, sadomasochistic, homoerotic art from the Middle Ages. You have weird stuff like this. Even in the Vatican itself, you have these odd. I find Michelangelo, much of his art, I mean, he's a great artist, but I find much of his art very strange. And that's why you get stuff like this from Archbishop Paglia, where he does just a full-blown gay chapel. But there's a long history of it in the Catholic Church, going back here, and here you got Paglia's uh, modern interpretation of it. So it's nothing new, unfortunately. So getting back to your article, you start out with tracing the history of the Uniate Church in the United States, but you go back a little further with, and I thought what was really interesting was this union of, I don't know how to say it, okay, thank you. I did a little digging into that. So that's where a group of Orthodox priests decided to convert to Latin Catholicism. And I did some research on that union, and it was the whole uniate project, like everything in Roman Catholicism, seems to be based on fear and coercion. And so it said on the Hungarian side of the Carpathian Mountains, as on the Polish side, the Orthodox Church had been the only church for more than 600 years since Eastern Christian Slavs had first arrived in the Carpathians. However, under the governance of the Kingdom of Hungary and later the Habsburg monarchy, Orthodox clergy saw their status slowly erode. In the 16th century, when Hungary implemented proprietary serfdom, Orthodox clergy were enslaved along with peasants and serfed along with peasants, while Catholic clergy were exempt. So, I mean, these priests had an incentive to convert to Catholicism. So, and that's where the whole Uniate project began.
Right. Well, see, that's why I wrote the reasons for both the schism in 1054 and this reunion were not theologically based. In other words, the motivation was more political than anything. It wasn't really. It's like the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience that a person in a religious order takes. Those vows are not, maybe they sound spiritual, but the basis of those vows is eminently practical.
Yep.
You know, but they're spiritualized later on. So
Yep.
the same thing is with these unions and these divisions and reunions. They're really not theologically based. They were really more practical. Who doesn't want to get his head cut off, or I mean, this is what we're dealing with.
Yeah, you wrote here that you wrote that there. So you wrote here that the Uniate priests um insisted upon the right to marry, and that they wanted to keep the practice of electing bishops as part of coming back to the Catholic Church, or not
Yeah.
coming back, but they never were in the Catholic Church, but of joining the Catholic Church.
Yes, those
Right.
those were the conditions which they lay down because they did not want to adopt celibacy that was adopted by the Western Church almost 100 years
Yep,
after
exactly.
the split in 1054, because it
Yeah,
wasn't until the Second Lateran Council,
I have that.
about 100 years later after the split, that celibacy was adopted.
I have it. So 1139 was the Second Lateran Council, which required mandatory celibacy. But it didn't go well because I did some research. 1179 at Lateran III, a number of attendees pushed for anti-sodomical initiatives. It was already a problem. There's also already a problem in the sodomy, because in the priesthood they weren't going to address something that wasn't going on. And then in 1219 at Lateran IV, there were already calls to abolish clerical celibacy because it wasn't working. So There you
But actually, there's something that a lot of people don't know. And this was uncovered by Jules Gomez, who is a Cambridge educated Latin biblical scholar who lives in Rome. And he read a number of Latin texts from that time around preceding the First and the Second Lateran Councils, where people were saying, look, if you adopt celibacy, what you're going to end up doing is you're going to discourage straight guys from becoming priests, and
Wow.
you're going to encourage gay guys. Now, remember, in 1054, when they split, who else was living at that time? None other than Peter Damian,
Damien, exactly.
the Book of Gomorrah. So you see, that discussion by these scholars who were writing at that time about the effects, they already knew what everything that Peter Damian reported about sodomy and amongst the clergy. And they said it's only going to get worse
Yeah.
if you implement celibacy. Now, there's something else that most people don't know, and that is that the Pope, who was in charge, who oversaw the council at that time, was Innocent the Second. But what's so important about that is the fact that Innocent the Second was a Benedictine monk.
Yeah.
Now, if you're a Benedictine monk, celibacy, again, is eminently practical. You cannot have a monastery with married people living together, because if you and I are in the monastery and we're both married, and you have a fight with your wife and I have a fight with my wife, then we share, you can't. So you cannot have monastic life where people are married.
Of course.
And so Innocent the Second, who oversaw the implementation of that uh, mandatory celibacy, never lived as a diocesan priest alone, a celibate life. So by mandating celibacy, remember, it was already mandated obviously for all the order priests, but now by making it a requirement for the diocesan priests,
Of
who
course.
oftentimes lived alone, had some really major psychological problems, because living alone, you don't have the kind of support that you might have if you're living in a monastery. So you're going to be tempted more. So that's why, even all the way up to the Middle Age, up until the time of the Protestant Reformation, you had even popes who were not practicing celibacy, who were married, who had girlfriends, who had wives, who had children. So even though people will point to the Second Lateran Council as the time when celibacy was implemented, the fact is, as we know today, it never was really followed,
No, and it didn't work.
especially for diocesan priests.
I have a quote here from, let me see, this is a good indeed. Okay. This is from Father John Strickland, and he's an Orthodox priest. And he goes through a lot. This really informed me too about, well, everything about the Catholic Church, and what really went wrong from the beginning. He wrote, indeed, the demand for clerical celibacy represented an effort to monasticize the parish clergy, which formerly had been distinct from monastics. But he did write, indeed, the demand for clerical celibacy represented an effort to monasticize the parish clergy, which formerly had been distinct from monastics. I think
That's
that's
critical, Joseph. That is so critical. That is exactly what happened. But here's the other problem. By doing that, the Pope, who was a Benedictine monk, created a paradigm which had no scriptural foundation whatsoever. Jesus whom priests are called to follow, whose life they are to emulate, lived as a monastic.
Yeah.
He didn't live alone. He lived in the company of his apostles.
Yeah.
He lived like, a Franciscan or a Benedictine or a Jesuit
Yeah.
or a Dominican,
Yeah.
always surrounded, by brothers, in the community. So this paradigm that was created, in the 12th century, by monastics
Mhm.
was a disaster, and it continues to be a disaster today. And no one wants to address the intrinsic flawed paradigm.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, the when the you did mention Peter Damian, and I've done some reading about him in the Book of Gomorrah, and it seems like that at the time the Book of Gomorrah was treated like it reminds me of that scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark at the very end where the guy is the Ark of the Covenant supposedly is in this big crate and they push it into some big warehouse somewhere in Washington, D.C. or whatever, never to be. That kind of reminds me of how the Book of Gomorrah was treated at the time. It was kind of too hot to handle. Then the church really didn't
Sort of like my seminary report. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it was just not fully appreciated, and like you said, it just got worse. Nothing. It wasn't the warnings that he gave were not heeded.
No,
So,
they were not. And the problem is when you attempt to solve one problem, sometimes you create more problems because you're not
yeah,
addressing what's really, involved.
yeah,
And over the centuries, the church tried to find some ways to make this work. For
yeah.
example, when I was growing up in a parish in Pennsylvania, the pastor had a housekeeper. A lot of the heterosexually oriented priests had housekeepers.
Mhm.
And that was like the Catholic solution to celibacy.
Yeah,
And for many years it worked. Actually, you did have some priests who were sexually involved with their housekeepers, but most of them probably, some were not. Okay,
mhm.
we don't know exactly how many were and how many were not. Now we do know that when I was growing up, the church right across the river from where I grew up was St. Stephen's Church, and the pastor got his housekeeper pregnant.
Wow,
They
this
had a daughter.
sounds familiar.
Was the pastor removed? No.
Mm.
He was allowed to stay there, raise his daughter, and today all three of them are buried together in the same mausoleum in Grandview Cemetery.
Wow, that's
But
interesting.
how was he able to get away with that? You know why?
I don't know.
Because he knew that Bishop Carroll had a girlfriend whom he was seeing 3 or 4 nights a week in the
Okay,
same town of Johnstown in the Westmont section,
okay,
in a very secluded mansion, which I can identify where it is today.
okay, okay, okay. Wow. Yeah. The dynamic between the monastic life as opposed to the parish life for a priest, I find it very interesting. And I also find it very sad in the West because I see the way that things work in Orthodoxy is parish priests who are out among the people, have a wife, typically have a wife and family to support them. Whereas in Roman Catholicism, a priest who's in the parishes is very much on his own. I mean, typically with the priest shortage, there's one or two priests at a parish, but they tend to live very separate lives. It's almost kind of like a bachelor pad where they just hang out and don't. There's no community life at all. And I think that's where priests, because I think there's certainly priests that have gone off the deep end, but I think there's priests that have tried to do the right thing and have suffered. And I think because of the way that they've been abandoned by their bishop, but just by the church in general, I think they've had to turn to other things. And I've seen so many priests that end up with alcohol problems, or they become obese because they're overeating, or they get issues with pornography or all kinds of things because they don't have a support
The support system.
system
I,
like you would in a monastery. Not that
well, I
monasteries
wrote
are perfect.
about that in an article published 5 months before the Boston Globe released their series of articles about abuse in Boston. I wrote an article in America Magazine, which would never be published in America today.
Wow.
but but I wrote an article entitled "Home Alone in the Priesthood."
Wow.
If you Google it, "Home Alone in the Priesthood, America, Gomulka," it'll come up. It's still available online. And my
Wow.
thesis was exactly what you just said. My thesis was that as more and more priests find themselves living alone, unlike in the past when there were two or three priests in a parish, they that living alone, they're going to be tempted more. And you're going to have more problems of drug abuse, alcoholism, sexual, what have you. And if we're two priests living together, and I'm tempted, I meet this woman, I'm heterosexual,
Mm-hmm.
and I can't bring her home to the rectory. If you're the
Mm-hmm.
pastor, what do you? I'm not going to pull that off. But let's say now there is no pastor. I'm the only one in the rectory, and I meet this woman. Or if I'm a gay priest and I meet this guy at a gay bar, well, I'm going to be far more tempted to bring him back to the rectory than I would if I were living with another priest. So as more and more priests live alone, you're going to have more DUIs and all these other kind of problems, as you mentioned.
I think in those situations the good priests suffer, but I think that's not even a safeguard if you got like a predator, because I was thinking of like McCarrick, how many people were around him, lived with him, uh, and claimed to not know anything. And I don't think that's true. And I also looked at I know he's a big hero among traditional Catholics again, Cardinal Pell. And he lived with an actual, violent sexual predator. And then he claimed not to know anything. And I find that hard to believe. I find that tough. So I think good priests suffer in that system, but I think bad priests can thrive within that conspiracy of silence too.
My experience as a priest was that in some cases you knew, some cases you didn't know.
Mm,
For example, when I was at the North American College in Rome, I was told the Carrick was visiting, look, don't get in the elevator alone with that guy.
wow.
So everyone knew.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But remember, when I lived with those two priests here in State College, Pennsylvania, from 1975 to 1980, I didn't know that they were hitting on my altar boys. I was in charge of the altar boys, fortunately.
Wow.
So if someone says, well, Father, well, didn't you know that Father Kelly and Father Single were hitting on the altar boys, that they were gay and taking advantage of them? No, honest to God, you know, remember, and I lived with Father Kelly for 3 years in Rome. We studied together in Rome. Then we worked in the parish for 3 years. His bedroom was right across the hall from mine. I had no idea what he was doing with those altar boys. They're that good at hiding.
Okay. Okay. Wow. Okay, well that makes me rethink it because I just yeah, I have a difficult it seems like somebody always knows. I mean, I was involved with a ministry in the Catholic Church for LGBT people, and there was a priest involved in that group that was predatory, and people told me look out for him. So it's like a lot of people knew,
Sure.
and it's just yeah, mm, yeah,
But see, the reason they
it's
know
it's tough for
is
me.
they know because they may be part of that. You see,
Yeah.
to ask me about Father Kelly when I was in Rome, is Father Kelly gay? I would have, what? I don't think he's gay. If you asked me in the parish, when we were in the parish, is Father Kelly gay? I'd say, no, I don't think so. But when Father Kelly went to Rome and one of the parishioners went to visit him, and at the end of the week, he asked one of the seminarians, hey, is Father Kelly gay? The seminarian, who was gay, said to him, are you kidding me? He's sleeping with half the faculty in the seminarians.
Oh.
Well, you see, that seminarian, because he was gay, was
Oh.
was involved with Father Kelly.
He was part of that network. So the priest, the Gene, if you don't mind me asking, those 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 predatory priests that were abusing your altar boy, how did you find out about that? How did that happen?
Uh, how did it happen with
Yeah.
the?
How did you find out what was going on?
Oh, it was only years later. In
Oh,
other words,
okay.
remember, most victims of sexual abuse report it decades later.
Correct.
But it was interesting, Joseph. One of the victims did not speak to me for like 30 years. And I couldn't understand why, because we were close. He was one of I had three altar boys who were like, Jesus had Peter, James, and John. I had three. And he was one of the three.
Oh,
But then I found out years later that he told me, he said, well, look, when I thought that you were like Father Kelly and Father Single. In other words, I never came on to him. I never did anything, of course, but because I was associated with Fathers Kelly and Single, we lived together. He assumed that I knew what they were doing and that I had the same problem that they did.
okay.
So it was years later. It was only years later that he came and he apologized to me profusely and said, look, I'm so sorry that I assumed that you were like them. Not that you ever did anything or anyone ever said or myself, but I just assumed that because they were that way, that you were that way too.
Wow. Okay. Let me share my screen again. This is Father Alexis Toth, who you talk about in the
Yes.
article, getting back to the uniates. It's interesting. There were a group of uniate priests who were really pushing back against the Vatican, who they wanted to impose sort of Latin restrictions upon the uniates, meaning they had to be celibate and bishops would be uh, selected by the Pope. So I read this article a bit differently maybe than you wrote it because I'm Orthodox and I see these men who eventually converted over to Orthodoxy and I'm like, great. Wonderful. And did you want to say anything about him? I thought he was an interesting person.
Well, again, the conversions, it was really, as I wrote, it was very unfair to have the uh, the married priest and the clergy immigrate to the United States with their almost their entire village, you
Yeah,
know, and then to be told by the American Irish bishop, who in some cases may himself have not been, heterosexually oriented, that that these guys had to either go back where you came from, take your wife and your kids, go back to the Ukraine or
unbelievable.
wherever, or get a job working in the steel mills in the coal mines. And of course, as you know, a lot of them said, well, we're going back to Orthodoxy. And they were accepted. And that's why the Russian Orthodox Church was founded in Johnstown, Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
I only lived 3 blocks from that cathedral in Johnstown. So that's why, it was easier for me to write about it because it was part of my neighborhood.
That's interesting. I know a priest out here in California who was raised Roman Catholic in Johnstown, PA, and now he's an Orthodox priest. I mean, he was never a Catholic priest, but that's interesting. And he does tell me how heavily Catholic that area is.
Well, it is,
Traditionally.
but do you know how
Yeah.
many priests are here today?
Oh, probably very
Remember, I
few.
wrote how many. Once they went over to Orthodoxy, and they were married, their numbers were growing and growing and growing.
Yeah.
Well, when I left the diocese here, there were 120 diocesan priests.
In the whole diocese?
Yes, in the whole diocese, diocesan priests. Okay.
Right.
Now, how many of those priests do you think were later found to have been abusers? How many were removed out of the 120?
25%. I don't know.
If you go online, you can pull it up because the Pennsylvania grand jury documented it all.
Yeah.
Out of the 120, we've identified 51
Well,
priests.
that's not good. Okay.
Now, how many priests do you think there are in the Altoona Johnstown diocese today, right now?
Half of that probably.
37.
Oh, wow.
We've
That's
gone from 120
well
to 137. Now,
decimated.
remember that priest I told you who got his housekeeper pregnant?
Yeah.
That was what used to be referred to as St. Stephen's Church. The church 1 block away, or actually not 1 block, right across the street. I mean, you could literally right across the street was St. Mary's Byzantine Church.
Mm.
Now, for years, remember, up until 2014, those restrictions imposed by the Vatican prohibited the Eastern Rite priests from marrying. But in 2014, that was lifted.
No.
So up until at the time when this Roman Catholic priest was involved with his housekeeper, the Greek Byzantine Church pastor there was not allowed to be married,
Mm.
and which in time led to a number of priests in the Eastern Rite becoming or being accepted as homosexuals. So you
I want
had
to talk
a
about that.
number of Byzantine churches pastored by gay priests, like you had in the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Now, they were almost forced today to close that church. But guess what? St. Mary's Byzantine Church is alive today. Why? Because they now have a married priest.
Of course. Of course. The you mentioned in the article, I can't pronounce Latin stuff. All semper
Semper.
is a semper. So that's from, I think I got a picture here. This is an icon of Father Alexis Toth. So of course he's well regarded in the Orthodox Church.
Yes.
Uh, I guess he would be considered a schismatic in the Catholic Church. Okay, here's of course, Pius X. He's like a god among the traditionalists. So in 1907, he issued this Semper, and that was no new married priest to be ordained in America amongst the uniates or to be sent there. So that's Pius the 10th. I find an interesting quote from Pius X. The Pope is not only the representative of Jesus Christ, but he is Jesus Christ himself, hidden under the veil of the flesh. Pope Innocent III. Every cleric must obey the Pope, even if he commands what is evil, for no one may judge the Pope. Yeah. Here's St. John Bosco. The Pope is God on earth. Jesus has placed the Pope higher than the prophets, than John the Baptist, than all the angels. Jesus has put the Pope on the same level as God himself.
Well, I think that Pope Francis thinks very much the same way.
Well,
I mean, remember, he's questioning the existence of hell today. Even though Jesus says, adulterers and fornicators were all this, he's even called into question that there really is a hell. So I guess he feels as Pope, he can put himself above God. He is what all those decrees said. As Pope, he can change theology and rewrite everything.
But he's among good company. I mean, including like Pius X, who the traditionals
Sure.
just love. So you wrote, it is estimated that over 100,000 Uniate faithful, along with many clergy, returned to the Orthodox Church. Thank God, I say. So as a result of all
Well,
this.
that's true, especially in the United States. However, Joseph, you have to
Okay.
understand
Okay.
that those decrees were not carried out in other places like Canada.
Wow.
So in Canada, unlike the United States, where you have a number of eparchies
Yeah.
that were where the parishes were pastored by homosexual priests
Mhm.
who came on to their teenage boys. In Canada, the Canadian bishops, because maybe it's more rural and so forth, they did not enforce those Vatican decrees because they knew that they would not get anyone to minister to those unions in Canada. So they allowed the uniate priest to come and function with with families, and
Uh,
that happened to a very good friend of mine who with whom I studied in Rome. He was going to be ordained. He was from Philadelphia originally, okay, but he did not feel that he could lead a celibate life as a priest. He did not want to go back to Philadelphia and be a Ukrainian celibate priest. So he left the seminary, went to Belgium, where he became a married deacon.
Good.
He was
Yeah.
on like Radio Free Belgium,
Yeah.
so when the wall fell, when he went to the Ukraine, when the Soviet Union dissolved, he was greeted because all the Ukrainians knew his voice, sort of like Radio Free Europe.
Yeah.
And then they said, Father Olufenko, celebrate Mass for us. He says, well, I'm only a deacon. I can't celebrate Mass. So the people says, Bishop, make Deacon Andrew a priest. And remember, in the tradition, in the Eastern Rite tradition, you can be ordained a priest after you're married, but not before you're. So he was eligible. He was married, so they ordained him a priest. But at that time, remember, he still couldn't go back to Philadelphia because they were still, the Americans were still enforcing ea semper, right?
Mm.
So what did he do? He didn't want to go back to Belgium. He didn't want to stay in the Ukraine. He immigrated with his family to Canada, where he lives today in Ottawa.
Awesome.
And he told me, yeah, we talk all the time.
Mm.
He said they do not have the problem with abuse amongst their clergy.
And
Like,
did he say why that is?
well, because they're married,
Exactly.
because they're married.
Exactly. So this is Father Orestes Shornock.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about him?
When I republished it recently, I did so only because when I learned that
It's
Byzantine church
yeah.
has a married priest, I thought it was relevant, so that's why I republished it. But
He you wrote Bishop because Bishop Ortensky did not enforce the celibacy provisions of Au Semper owing to a shortage of celibate clergy. Father Orestes Chornock and other priests felt no reservations about encouraging young men from their parishes to become married priests. So I mean, this was I guess you were talking about how this didn't go over too well among the unions, and there was a lot of resistance among them to enforce celibacy.
oh, absolutely. But it's only logical because again, when you're dealing with diocesan priesthood, remember, Joseph, that there is a monastic tradition in the Eastern Rite. So ordinarily, their bishops, as I
Yeah,
pointed out, their bishops come ordinarily from the monastery. So a bishop in the Eastern Rite is not married,
correct.
and therefore he's ordinarily a priest from the monastic life.
Correct.
But in this case, where you have a bishop then whose wife or who comes and well, anyhow, if you're a priest and you're a married priest and your wife
Yes.
dies,
Yes.
then you qualify, as he did, to become a bishop.
Right.
But then again, as a bishop, because both, you were familiar with married life and
Yeah.
celibate life now that you're a bishop, they still recognize that celibacy, even when you bring that up in Judaism, if you ask a rabbi about what's the Jewish perspective on clerical celibacy, they'll laugh at you. They said there's no. They recognize it just is against nature. It doesn't work. You
Yeah.
cannot put people in that situation
Yeah.
and not expect, because the idea, unless again, if you're homosexual, that's different. But if you're a heterosexual, there's a basic human drive to procreate, to have a family, children,
Correct.
and to is very, very
And companionship.
well. Yes, and that's why
Yeah,
Richard Sipe, God rest his soul,
I agree.
remember, he said that on one hand, at any given moment in time, no more than half the priests are living a celibate life. So
Yeah.
right now, if you're in Africa, you're having sex with your wife or your girlfriend. If you're in the United States or Europe, where the chances of you being a homosexual, you're
You're
having sex with another guy.
exactly. Usually another priest a lot of times.
Exactly. But now he also showed that from his studies that no more than about maybe 2% of priests can say that they lived their entire lives on this earth
Wow. I believe it.
without ever having had sexual relations with a man or a woman.
Yeah. The one thing about this article, the two that reminded me about Diane Enley's book is, so one of the things she wrote about in here was that the forced celibacy in the West didn't go down that easy. It's not because most, even in the West, most parish priests were married and had a family,
Yes.
and there was a lot of resistance. It didn't go down that well. It took a long time. It took a lot of coercion. Like I said, that's how they do things in Catholic Church. A lot of persecution and a lot of coercion, and for that to finally, you know, well,
Yeah. Well,
anyway.
I have to say, really, Joseph, I don't know any period or time or place where it wasn't a problem, where it was practiced.
Yeah.
And you see, the church doesn't want to admit to that. In other words, the church would rather if I'm a priest, have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, just keep it quiet so
Yeah.
that when I die, then the church can come in and inherit everything I own. You know?
Exactly.
But you see, the problem is if I get married and people find out about it, then my wife inherits everything. The church doesn't get anything.
Hmm.
And it's cheaper for me to be employed as a celibate priest fooling around on the side than
Yeah.
it is a married priest with a wife and a bunch of kids.
I also think that for celibacy and then the secret sex cults within the Catholic Church, as you call them, it's also very important. They're more easily controlled than
Oh, sure.
a married man, because a married man, presumably, I mean, they can be dysfunctional too, but a married man is presumably living a healthy life. But then you've got a for celibate man who's either got girlfriends on the side or is homosexual. So that's somebody that's easier to control because you have something on them
Oh,
as
absolutely.
well as well. I'm always struck by the difference in character between the priests that I've met in Orthodoxy as opposed to the ones that I've met in Roman Catholicism. the ones in Orthodoxy, and I hate to reduce it to this, but they definitely have a masculine, independent, sort of strong character. The ones in the overall impression that I got from Catholic priests is one of timidity and fear.
Yes, you're and you also find a certain number of them are going to be effeminate,
Yeah,
and they're
true.
not going to be. I remember, God rest his soul, Archbishop Ryan, who was the first Archbishop for the military services, who served with the Marines in World War II in the Pacific battles of Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. He liked to go out with me for dinner. He has one of his favorite restaurants was La Colline on Capitol Hill in D.C.
Mm,
And he said, I'd like to go out with you because he says you're a real man. Because he was living with these others who were not, heterosexuals. So consequently, he basically uh, reflected on the fact that what you're saying, that he found that a lot of them weren't, as uh, because he was straight himself. He just was very uncomfortable with them.
I want to get into that in the seminary when we talk about the seminaries, because I think if you do have a young man who has a masculine core about him, I think that's beaten out of you in the seminaries. So you wrote it pretty extensively about this book. It was by a John. I'm always bad with these last names. John Mahali, and it was about this particular young man's experience with trying to be ordained as a uniate priest, but one who was also married. I thought it was interesting his story, and you go through it, how he was denied ordination.
And I spoke with his son, and I reference also his grandson in my paper.
That is cool. It was interesting because he was told that being married and having a wife and children could be a source of perplexity and scandal. I thought that's really ironic
I
because,
think it's a lot more scandalous when you take,
gosh,
as they did in Springfield, Illinois, and put two gay priests together, and everybody knew what they were about. And it only came out, years later that they were both outed. And I think that's just as scandalous. Or to find, today when you go to a cemetery and you find two priests buried together. So I don't know what is so scandalous about a priest marrying a woman.
yeah, well. You wrote, in response to Roman Catholic leaders that found married Greek Catholic priests to be, quote, a source of perplexity or scandal, Father Mihaly wrote, quote, all Christian philosophies consider that priesthood and matrimony as holy sacraments cannot be in conflict from the moral point of view. Quote, he argued that neither, quote, celibacy nor marriage decide the individual morals of the priest, but his internal disposition, unquote. I know. Let's go to this article, and it's called "This Cult Sex." Father's genes never subtle. Sex cults in seminaries to obey or break away. So what I think what I tried to get at in our discussion with the uniates, vis-a-vis Jean's first article, is the issue of forced celibacy, and how it's really racked kind of chaos, disorder, abuse, heartache, suffering, in the Catholic Church, I think for hundreds of years. And then how has the issue of celibacy manifested itself within Catholic seminaries? And I think they've created very unhealthy, toxic, abusive, spaces. I have to tell you, my first impression of a Catholic seminary is this was shortly after I guess you could say, went back to the Catholic Church. I was living down in LA for a while. And I was a practicing Catholic, very traditional. I was going to the Latin Mass. And I did meet some traditionally minded Catholic priests or Catholic seminarians in the most unexpected of places, and that was St. John's Seminary in Camarillo.
Camarillo. I lived
Oh,
nearby, 10 minutes away.
oh, well, beautiful area, but absolute hellhole. So I became friends with a seminarian there. I found and I visited there a few times, had lunch with the seminarians. It was interesting. I was still sort of not come to terms with my own abuse in the Catholic Church, and I was being gaslit, and I think I was mentally unwell. But I found it a very strange psychology there. It was very much a courtier class. It was very strange. I just thought the way that the professors were treated by the seminarians, it was very odd. It was very cultish. I met one seminarian who was traditional, but very much willing to go along with the status quo because that was what was required. Ordination was the prize. And in order to get that, you had to go through this very psychotic, sadistic sort of almost like the military, but in a very sick way, basic training program. And I think you had to prove yourself to be malleable and not a good way. So one day he told me that he was having a discussion with his spiritual director, and his spiritual to me it was sounded a lot like fishing. His spiritual director was asking him a lot of questions about his sexual fantasies, if he dreamed, what kind of sexual dreams he had. I was like, it's none of his business.
He
But
wanted to sleep with them. This
it's
is
it's
what
a fish.
faculty
It
members
was it was a
do.
fish. It's a
Faculty members will play upon you. They want to groom you, and if you're especially if you disclose to them that you have a homosexual orientation, wow, that makes it so much easier for them. And they don't realize that, look, just because you may be gay doesn't necessarily mean that you want to sleep with them.
this
But
guy
that's the
this
assumption
this
they have on their part.
this seminarian was same-sex attracted. That's how I
Yes,
became friends with. I mean, there was nothing between him and I, but
sure.
I was like, oh my gosh, this is horrible. I mean, to me, it was like, no, this is not healthy. It's none of his business to what you're thinking about. It's insane. Unless it's something that you want to talk about in spiritual direction or confession. But for him to do a fishing expedition like that is, to me, it was a big red flag. But that was the environment in the seminary there. And very bad, very, very bad.
It hasn't changed. I
That
lived
was
there.
25 years ago.
Well, I lived in Oxnard, next to
Mm.
Camarillo, up until 2004. And I visited St. John's Seminary in Camarillo a number of times. Uh, and you're absolutely right. I mean, it was just, it was, and people don't realize that it's not just the straight guys that leave the seminary because
Hmm.
their proposition,
Hmm.
but it's the homosexual uh, seminarians, some who really want to lead a celibate life,
Correct.
but then their proposition and basically, look, if you don't put out for us, you're not going to be ordained.
Exactly. I talked with this one guy, and I had no reason to believe that he was same-sex attracted, but I said, "Why are you willing to put up with this environment here?" And he really felt, and he was sincere, and this is where I think it gets, troublesome, is that he truly believed that God was calling him to be a priest, and that there's nothing else he could do that you know would make him happy in life. So he had to be a priest. And he was willing to put up with almost anything. And I go, that's not a good place to be. God does not want you to be a priest so bad that you submit yourself to this kind of abuse and manipulation and gaslighting. It's insane. It's
Well,
crazy.
again,
It's
a lot of
crazy.
them think that it's only going to as long as they get ordained. Remember,
Well,
Father,
then, well, let me interrupt you, Gene. Then the disassociation is so bad. These guys I've talked to, they think that if that when they get ordained, everything is going to change. Well, then they'll be a priest and they can kind of do what they want. Oh, no, I don't think so. Then the
that's
thumb is
exactly what I
really
was going to say.
go ahead. Sorry.
But see, that happened with Father Richard Biernat. Father Richard Biernat was was sexually assaulted by a priest in the diocese of Buffalo,
Oh,
Father
I know
Smith.
his story. Yeah. Ugh.
And so when he was called in by auxiliary bishop Edward Grosch, who was also a predator, who was even preying on young boys at the Marriott Hotel in Krakow, Poland, you know, uh, he was called in and said, "Look, Richard, either keep your mouth shut about what happened with Father Smith,
Mhm.
or I'm going to send you back to Poland and you'll never be ordained."
Exactly.
Of course, Richard kept his mouth shut, was ordained, thinking, well, now I'm ordained, I'm home free.
Mhm.
Wrong. So he's working as a maintenance man today.
Yeah, God bless him. You wrote at the beginning of this article, professionals who provide deprogramming therapy to victims who have been lured into cults report that cult leaders often use blackmail and extortion to prevent recruits from breaking away from the fold. These cult leaders require members to confess their deepest secrets and vulnerabilities as part of the grooming process, and later threaten to use these secrets against those who fail to comply with cult practices. This is exactly what goes on in the Catholic Church. I got to tell you, when 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 I got out of the life that I got out of, which was like uh, uh, the gay sex industry, it's kind of like, well, what do you do? Well, I have to kind of laugh about it now, but you move, cross country to work for these Catholic priests in Pennsylvania, and that's what I did in the Scranton diocese. They were traditional Latin Mass priests, and I went to work for them, and they also became my spiritual director and my confessors, and I told them things about what I had done in my past life, and they used it against me because
Sure.
I started going to them and saying, there's odd things going on with some of the priests here. I go, and it makes me uncomfortable. And they said, well, this is gaslighting 101. They said, well, your past life is clouding your judgment here. You're seeing things that aren't there. You're kind of projecting your past abuse onto these priests. Nothing's going on. Well, it was exactly what was going on. And then later, when I got subpoenaed, what did they do? They drug up all that stuff about my past. They use it. They will use it as a weapon, and they will break the seal of confession without a second thought.
Oh, they definitely they definitely will break the seal of confession. Remember the case of Father Michael Casaubon, who was abused when he was in the seminary, which again oftentimes causes, because he never had a sexual relationship or even an emotional relationship with a woman before that. So that abuse that he experienced really impacted his sexual orientation. So he goes off to Rome, gets ordained, but now he goes up to Washington from Charleston, to go to gay bars, right? Comes back to Charleston, meets a guy, gets married civilly,
Wow.
goes back to his bishop and says, I feel like a hypocrite because I'm the pastor of this parish, but I'm married to this guy.
Wow.
And what does the bishop who's gay say to him? Congratulations, Father. Just keep it quiet. Okay, now get this, Joseph. I'm not making this up.
No, no, I believe every word.
What happens next is he feels kind of guilty, because he's leading a double life. But now he's upset because the priest who groomed him and abused him, because now he realizes that, look, that priest really wasn't my friend. He abused me, and he's out there abusing other kids today, to this day, because he's still in ministry. So Casaubon goes back to his bishop and says, look, I want you to remove Father so-and-so from ministry because I'm afraid he's abusing other people like he abused me.
Oh man.
What did the bishop say to him? Father Casaubon, did you tell me that you were married?
Yeah.
Oh, Father, we can't have that. You're going to have to leave the priesthood.
Of course.
So, in other words, they got rid of him, not because he married this man,
Yeah.
not because he was leading a double life, but because he reported
He blew the whistle.
abuse. And maybe, you think maybe that abusive priest may have also been sleeping with that bishop?
Of course, of course, of course. It's a cabal. You wrote same-sex attracted young men who enter seminaries with the intention of remaining celibate are especially vulnerable to a superior's whims because they risk being dismissed in accord with the church's official position on homosexuality, although this teaching is rarely practiced by members of the clergy. That's true. That's true. I found that to be the case where a lot of, especially religious orders, and I have to say I've noticed it with the Jesuits, the Paulists, the OFMs, they're very self-selective. And because you have a center or a core in those orders that's homosexual, they're going to choose homosexual. Well, I can't understand why a heterosexual man would be attracted to those groups in the first place. So, I mean, I think they're so overtly nowadays, especially under Francis, they're so overtly publicly pro
Oh yeah, no, they won't.
homosexual.
If you ask me to go with you to a gay bar and I'm straight, I'm not going to go. I'm going to be very, very. Remember, Father Donald Cousins, who wrote, the Changing Face of the Priesthood,
Yeah,
where he talks about how the sexual orientation and the ethnic face of the priesthood is changing. And he said, what happens is when you take a straight guy and put him in a predominantly gay environment,
mm,
what happens is what is referred to as destabilization. It's a feeling where the straight guy feels very, very uncomfortable in that environment. He has to leave. He wants to get out of that environment because he feels very, very threatened and very, very uncomfortable. So when you talk about, the Jesuits, the Franciscans, the Paulists, if you're a straight young man, you go to this environment, you're going to be, very, very uncomfortable, and you're going to leave.
exactly, exactly. So they're self-selecting groups. That's just what they've done. Let me share my screen again. So one of the cases that you mentioned is very disturbing of predation is a Father Mikhail, like I can't pronounce these names. Mikhailo Dosyak.
But yeah,
So he's a Ukrainian Catholic
the Ukrainian
priest.
Catholic priest,
This is a uniate. Um,
right?
I did a little research on him. I don't want to get into politics, but I just like to know what I'm reading. He said something kind of disturbing. So this was something that this this priest said about Vladimir Putin. He said we need to kill him, but we need to kill him because if we will not do that, he will kill all of humanity because he's even worse than Hitler. Strange, very, very strange. How do these people? I don't know. It's kind of shocking for a religious person to get up and talk about killing someone and having somebody do it. It's very bizarre. So this was
Yes.
Fall River Ukrainian priest. We need to kill Putin.
Well, of course, remember that I reported about him that I ordinarily, when I deal with abuse victims, uh, I don't use their names unless they are willing to allow their names to be included in my articles. Well, in this particular case, the victim, Joshua Metcalf,
I see that.
uh, does not not object to my using his name because he wants his case out there.
God bless him. He's brave.
He's brought suit against Dosiak. You see, he was living with Dosiak, and when he shared with him, as you mentioned, in some cases where a person shared their background, he felt called to be a priest, but at the same time, with his background and so forth, he grew up with a homosexual orientation.
Yeah.
And he reached a point where he didn't like that lifestyle and he led a celibate life.
God bless
So
him.
he went there with the intention of being a celibate, priest. Well, guess who his spiritual director here is? His formator here, who he's living with in Rhode Island,
Oof.
is this Father Dosiak, who keeps coming on to him and propositioning him and so forth. And in the end, Joshua leaves. In the end, he almost commits suicide,
Oh,
not so much because of what Dosiak did to him, but because the bishop, the eparch of Stamford, Connecticut, did not, defend him. Interestingly, when he reported what happened to him,
they never defend the victim.
Right.
Ever.
But get this, you'll like this. Remember I told you that in 2014, the Eastern rites were allowed to have married clergy now in the United States?
Yeah.
Guess what? The Safe Environment Coordinator for the Eparchy of Stamford, Connecticut, is a married priest. So when Joshua went to report it, he wasn't reporting it to another gay priest like Dosiak. He reported it to a straight married priest who immediately supported him, who referred him to a spiritual director and to a psychologist in Boston who examined him, who also confirmed everything that he said. So that right now, this case in Rhode Island in court, he has a very, very, very strong case because not only does he have emails and so forth from Dosiak, propositioning him and so forth, but he also has, the testimony of the married Safe Environment Coordinator and the two, specialists in Boston who would confirm everything he said. He said he finds them very credible, but what also makes this case kind of egregious is the fact, too, that he was almost led to commit suicide.
I believe it. You also go on to say that case is similar to another case, and then in that you use a pseudonym, Robert. You said in that case, sex was a requirement in exchange for ordination.
Right. There was another case, and that was in Washington. I mean, there's actually so many that I'm dealing with. It's sometimes hard for me to keep them all straight.
You gave 3 examples in this article, and another pseudonym you used was Dan.
I'm trying to remember.
It says Dan's case exposes the hypocrisy of gay bishops who claim that they do not permit homosexuality in seminaries, only to reward gay clergy who keep the code of silence.
Right. But again, there are a number of cases and individuals that I deal with, some who were heterosexuals in the seminary, some who were homosexuals in the seminary. There's a case, there's another court case, may have been, it involves, he also allows, because the case is in court, it can be looked up, in the case of Timothy Passo, who's bringing a suit in New York, where he was propositioned by a Father Callahan, who was using his gay grinder and account, to pick up guys, and he was able to document with all these pictures from the grinder account how Father Callahan, who was coming on to him, was having
Mhm.
sex with all these other guys. So
Oh,
all these they're in court. These are court cases now.
yeah.
They're active, and I think the seminarians have a very strong case.
You also mentioned former seminarians in Chile who were directly under this guy's jurisdiction, Bishop Gonzalo Duarte. Of course, you never find a Catholic bishop that'll turn away a microphone, So the accusations of abuse were pretty egregious there in Chile.
Well, again, this is going on in all countries, especially uh, although, as I said, parts of Africa and Asia, it's not so much the case. But South America, North America, Europe, it's very common today.
And in Latin America, the Catholic Church is tanking. Numbers are way
Oh,
down, are way down. Now, Brazil used to be the largest Catholic country in the world. It's not anymore. It's not predominantly Catholic anymore because
well,
people
it,
are
it is.
people are leaving. They're leaving. They're
Well,
just,
but it makes sense. You have to understand that. I mean, 50 years ago, Joseph, when I was in Rome, I went to the Latin American seminary, which was called Pio Latino.
mm,
And I was a very, very, very naive American seminarian because I grew up, in Pennsylvania, where priests were celibate and so forth, and lived in rectories with two or three priests and so forth. Well, when I visited my friend Cesar Landivar, who was from Quito, Ecuador, I went to the seminary and I found it interesting that Sunday that like half the people out there were women in the refectory for lunch.
hmm.
And then when we went up to the rooftop of Pio Latino for coffee and after dinner drinks and desserts, when they cranked up the Latin music, they're dancing and they're really dancing kind of intimately. You know what I mean?
Oh dear.
And I said to Cesar, Cesar, you know, ¿cómo se puede explicar, no? ¿Qué estás bailando así? And he said, well, look, you dumb North American, do you think I'm going to go back to Ecuador, live out there in the jungle by myself? You're nuts. I can't do that. When you're going to go back to an American parish where there's going to be other priests living with you, like in a monastic setting,
Yeah.
people are going to put money in a collection basket. You're going to live after that, live a very comfortable life. The only time I'm going to have people coming to church is going to be hatched, matched, and dispatched. They're not going to come to church on Sunday and put money in a collection basket. I'm going to have to get a job teaching, to earn a living. So what I do with my life, if I have a wife and kids, and if they don't like it, find somebody else.
Exactly. Wow. Oof. You wrote in this article, sexual secrecy is the currency in the church, and learning how to use it is almost treated like an art form in seminaries. I got an example, Gene. This was a few years ago. I met this priest, and I had no suspicions about him. He was a moral man, but he was a bit rogue. I think he tended to do what he wanted to liturgically. He was very traditional, but he was in a more liberal diocese. And I was kind of like, Father, how do you get away with what you're doing? Because he was kind of doing his own thing at his parish. I go, it's cool, but how do you get away with it? He told me he had pictures of his bishop. I mean, it sounds cynical and it sounds really bizarre, but for Catholics to hear this, that's how bad it is, but that's what he told me. And he wasn't being silly. He was serious.
But that's exactly the way it is. I can tell you priests today in certain dioceses out west. I won't name him. I will tell you the diocese with the name of the bishop or the priest. But he is functioning today only because he has dirt on the bishop. Just like, remember I told you that Slovak priest who got his housekeeper pregnant and raised the daughter in the rectory? He got that because he knew the bishop, was carrying on an affair with this woman, in the same town. So blackmail I mean, look at people like Father Adam Park, who came on to all these seminarians in Rome and documented in this court case in New York Supreme Court today that Cardinal Dolan and the North American College are covering up. Why is Father Adam Park allowed to be in ministry in Washington, D.C. today, right now, by Cardinal Gregory? Why is Gregory leaving him there in ministry after all of these seminarians signed sworn statements that he came on to them and so forth? He propositioned them. Why? Because Father Adam Park knows all the dirt about Gregory, who was called, the African Queen in Atlanta
Oh,
before, he came to Washington. He knows all the dirt about Cardinal World, who he was his secretary for a while. He knows all the dirt on McCarrick, the three, cardinals in Washington whom he works for.
right. You wrote, while cult leaders often mask their nefarious underworld by marketing their cults as pathways to wisdom or self-empowerment, gay church leaders attract young men by advertising seminaries as supernatural places where they will learn to become an alter Christus and prepare to combat to save souls. That's exactly it. Preys upon people's good intentions. And I think that's what I was talking about with that anecdotal story about St. John's at St. John in Camarillo, where there were guys that didn't know that didn't understand the environment that they were entering. And I think that once they do, I think they have to make a decision pretty quick. Do I play along or do I leave?
And that's why it's much, much more difficult for the straight seminarian.
Yeah.
Because you see, for the young man who lives with same-sex attraction, and who's living in the closet, the priesthood is offers him, anonymity. People are going to assume, well, you gave up having a wife and children to follow our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and a comfortable life, stability, and
Mhm.
boyfriends, in the diocese, to meet with. But for
Mhm.
the straight guy who goes there, and once he discovers what's going on, it's going to be very, very difficult, because he knows that he may be very, very, very much alone
Yeah.
in his
But
life.
but the Catholic Church has cleaned all this up. I was watching EWTN and lo and behold, who pops up on the screen? You know who this is, Gene, don't you?
I think I do, but he
It's
looks
it
older than that.
this is Monsignor Walter Rossi.
Yes.
Monsignor Walter Rossi. The rector of the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C.
Okay. Yes, I thought that's what I was going to say, because
But
I
if
knew
you, yeah,
how he was investigated, and how he was investigated by, it was a fraud investigation by Barbera and Gregory, after
exactly.
George Neumeier wrote those articles, documenting his homosexual misconduct and relationships.
Because if you look up mainstream media articles about him and the abuse accusations made against him, the headlines are not credible. It was cleared by church tribunals. So it's the insiders, you know, doing their own investigation. It's the abusers.
The Pope said the same thing about Batista Rica. If you read my article that came out yesterday, where I talk about where the Brazilian reporter asked the Pope on the flight coming back from Rio, about his friend Batista Rica, who had his live-in boyfriend, in where he worked in the embassy, and who was caught having sex with a gay prostitute in an elevator, who then was later beaten up in a gay, a park. What does the Pope say? Oh, that was investigated, but it was not found credible.
Exactly.
Hello, one case, but three. The same thing is true here with Rossi. I mean, there was a George Neumeier, didn't just find one piece of evidence. He found multiple pieces of evidence. And so there's always, people like the Pope and even McElroy. Remember when Richard
Mhm.
Sipe brought him the names of 12 seminarians and young priests who said that they were abused by McCarrick. What did McElroy and the Pope say? Oh, it was unsubstantiated. You won't give us all their names. Well, of course, some of these guys were still priests. They didn't want to give their names because they knew if their names were used, they would be thrown into the street.
Yeah. You wrote here, there he is again. You wrote here, perhaps the church's best kept secret is how many cardinals, archbishops, and bishops preyed upon young men who today, as priests, pass this tradition on. I think you were onto something there because I mean, I'm a survivor and I know lots of survivors and we've never abused anybody or have any thought about it. But in my research on just the topic of homosexuality in general, the rates of childhood sexual abuse among homosexual men is very high.
But that's why, Joseph, I think you have to make a very important distinction, as you just made. Just because, just as while all squares are rectangles, not all rectangles are squares.
Correct.
So just as while a lot of the abuse that we see, over 80% of the victims of abuse in the Catholic Church is perpetrated by men with same-sex attraction, it doesn't mean that all priests who have a homosexual orientation are predators.
Correct.
And even, for example, if you were abused, just like if you grew up in a home with an alcoholic father or mother,
Mm-hmm.
you might later on become an alcoholic.
Yeah,
Or you may never want to have a drink in your life.
exactly.
If you grow up in a home where you've witnessed your father beating up your mother, you may get married and abuse your wife. Or you may say, sweetheart, my dad used to treat my mom this way. I will never, never, never do that in my life. So that's what I see happens. But Richard Sipe, God rest his soul, mentioned about, as you say, passing the tradition on. In many cases, after they were groomed and abused, they will go on and abuse others. But you have to understand the difference is this. You are going to be less inclined to abuse another young man like you were abused if in your mind now you look back on what happened, you say, that was wrong. He abused me. But now, let me tell you this, Joseph. If I abused you and now I'm your best friend, I'm the bishop, you're the
Yeah,
priest in the diocese.
exactly.
We get together for dinner, so forth. Where you see what I did to you when you were a young seminarian, and I was on the faculty of the North American College in Rome, or wherever, or St. John's in Camarillo. If I groomed you and I befriended you and I gave you all these gifts, we did this stuff together, you may look upon what I did to you as not abuse, but as friendship, as love. And if that's how you interpret in your mind what happened to you, you are going to be more inclined to go and try that with another young man yourself. But you see, you're not a danger to young people because in your mind, you know that what happened to you was abuse. That was wrong. But if you looked upon that as love and friendship, you may want to try it again. That happened with a priest, also Father Kelly, who I told you about. I lived with. I was also ordained the same year with the Father George Kaharchik, who was abused by his uncle, and he went out and he, in time, abused other young men because his uncle groomed him, bought him all these gifts. But then Father Kaharchik also had a brother whom he abused, but his brother would never abuse anyone because he saw what his brother did to him as
Exactly.
abuse.
exactly,
So it
exactly.
depends on how you process what happened to you. So it will either make you an alcoholic or not, or make you an abuser or not. It depends how you
Yeah.
process what happened in the past.
That's really important. I agree 100%. And that scenario can play out within these institutions, but it also happens, I've seen it just on individual basis with people. And within a dysfunctional environment like the Catholic Church, healing is not possible. It's not. I kind of wanted to wrap things up. Catholics kind of argue that, especially the McCarrick case, well, was one bad pope and one bad cardinal. Okay, we got three bad apples, or you got three F ups here. So I think that says a lot about the papacy and the way that the Catholic Church is organized and its theology. Because here you've got McCarrick with Saint John Paul II, with Pope Benedict, and Pope Francis. So this is a larger problem than one bad pope, because
Oh, absolutely.
I think a lot of traditional Catholics want to lay every. I'm not a fan of Francis, but I think they want to lay everything at his doorstep.
Right. Well, all three of them covered up abuse before and after
Thank you,
they were made popes. Now you have to understand, Joseph.
thank you.
Remember, ja mówię po polsku. Rozumiesz? I knew John Paul II when he was a cardinal when I was a seminarian in Rome.
Wow.
I've celebrated mass with him on different occasions. He baptized my best friend's daughter. I held the basin. He poured the water. You know, so I know, the people we're dealing with here. Okay, but as much as I loved John Paul II and respected him, at the same time, I cannot dismiss the fact that I later on learned, and saw how he covered up not only abuse involving young people, but also what happened. Look what happened when he was the Pope in the 1990s, when all the women, the nuns in Africa, were being abused by the priests and the bishops who wanted to use them for sex because they didn't want to get AIDS.
Oh, dear
All
Lord.
those reports, remember, and what happened when what did they do with the mother superiors who reported that to the Vatican? Did they take the reports and get rid of the abuse of bishops and priests? No. They sent the mother superiors, the whistleblowers, back to Belgium. And what happened today, Joseph, in Belgium? Did you read the news today?
No, no.
Oh, remember the Belgians, these were the Belgian Congo, remember?
Yes, yes.
So the Belgians were really upset what was happening to their nuns, right? Did you know that in the year 2000, the European Parliament issued a formal condemnation of the Vatican?
No,
You didn't know that.
no,
You know what happened today when the Pope went to Belgium?
no.
The king and the prime minister attacked him right away for what he failed to do with regard to abuse.
Good.
Today, this very day, he gets off. He's, oh, here I am, the Pope. Everybody loves me. Hold it. They confronted him right away because they remembered too how the Vatican covered up the rape of all of their nuns, their Belgian nuns, and how these church leaders covered up the abuse of all these Belgian kids, by priests or in these schools and so forth. And even how children are not only sexually abused by priests, but what you don't hear about too
Mm.
today is how a number of nuns abuse them. Because you see, homosexuality is a problem for a lot of priests, but the church doesn't want to talk about how that problem is also true, and that there are just as many lesbian nuns today as there are homosexual
Oh,
priests
tell me about it. Yeah.
who abuse young girls.
Oh, I know. Tell me about it. traditional Catholics, because that's my point of reference, I keep going back to them. They think that Africa is going to save the church. Well, they thought Ireland would save the church. They thought Latin America would save the church. They thought Poland would save the church. It's a domino. Africa, I'm telling you, with the abuse that I'm hearing that's taking place there, it's a matter of time.
Well, again, and there's different types of abuse. Just as a friend of mine worked on the Congregation for Bishops, and their job was to, make bishops in Africa, at least in that particular individual. Well, anyhow, they had a really, really difficult time. Not not because they couldn't find someone who didn't have sex with women, who didn't have any girlfriends. They had a hard time finding a priest that didn't have children.
Weren't
So
weren't
it wasn't
weren't
just
yeah.
it wasn't just the fact that the African priests, were like using nuns for sex, so to avoid getting AIDS and so forth. They had a hard time finding a African priest who did not have one or two priests, or one or two or three or four or five or even eight children.
Yeah. Weren't in the West, weren't problem priests sometimes sent over to the missions where they could just abuse kids
Oh, that's been documented.
all they
Remember
wanted?
Martin Boudreau, uh, who in his documentary Sex Abuse in the Church, The Code of Silence, uh, Martin Boudreau documented that very, very, very well. How priests, were even, like, for example, from Italy, sent to Argentina. And that was a good connection too, because remember, Bergoglio, Pope
Mm.
Francis, was Italian.
He had no
So
case. He
they
had
set up that
yeah.
direct line. They would send all the abusive priests from Milano and places like that to Argentina, and they would employ them there, only then for them to rape, even some of the deaf children in the orphanage there.
He had no abuser priests in Buenos Aires in his
Of
archdiocese.
course, he said
That's
in
what
his
he
book
claimed.
on heaven and earth, it never happened in my diocese.
Dear Lord, help us. Okay. Okay. I wanted to I wanted to end with this. I don't think celibacy, if it was reversed, mandatory celibacy is going to solve any of the problems in the Catholic Church. This is something I posted. Nothing gets the vitriol of the Catholic laity like this post. I wrote the priesthood and orthodoxy versus Roman Catholicism. Now, the Catholic laity, the hate that they expelled upon me for making this observation. You think they would reserve that for predator priests or for the bishops that covered it up? No, they saved that for survivors who want to make an observation. The laity is a big issue in the Catholic Church, and there's a lot of resistance to reform.
But they do not. I get email from people from all over the country who respond to my writings, right?
Yeah.
Well, there was one person who responded recently, and he says, "I'm just an agitator. Why are you writing all this dirt?" You know, I'm saying, well, I'm trying to save this church. I want to try to motivate people to get out there and try to do something about this. And then I ultimately concluded, no, I said, look, remember, like uh, Jack Nicholson said in A Few Good Men, you want the truth, you
Oh,
can't
yeah.
handle the truth. Well, I said to him, you don't want the truth.
Exactly.
You don't want the truth because you can't handle the truth.
Thank you.
And that's Catholics. Just like the woman whose husband's been fooling around on her for 20 years, and the neighbor tells her, don't tell me that. I don't want to hear that my husband's been unfaithful to me. So Catholics, Joseph, when you post those kind of things on your site, it gets them upset because they do not want the truth. They can't
Exactly.
handle it.
No, no,
They
no.
want to believe that the Pope is celibate. He said he had a girlfriend, but he only lasted 10 days and he gave her up.
I
I
think
mean,
there's,
who has a girlfriend for 10, in your whole life, what? You have a girlfriend for 10 days, that makes you a heterosexual.
I think there's a lot of Catholics who think the church has just been recently infiltrated, and we're talking like post-Vatican II period. And before that, it was kind of like something out of Beckett, the Richard Burton movie, with monks walking around in candles and chanting, and everything was perfect. I found this is a interesting example. So during the close of the 11th century, Archbishop Ralph II of Tours persuaded King Philip of France to install his young gay lover as the Bishop of Orleans. The young man, John, had previously been the lover of Ralph's brother. Ralph's brother was the former Bishop of Orleans. When Ivo, the Bishop of Chartres, found out about the sordid gay sex triangle, he wrote to Pope Urban II, begging him to intervene. The Pope refused his request. This has been going on for a long time. Then I found this other somebody that reads my watches my podcast. It said look into somebody called Jean-Claude Corviel or Corvale. I don't know how to pronounce. He was a French priest, 1787 to 1866. Very well known, very influential mystic, and he pretty much had free reign around France where he abused boys. This has been going on a long time. It's not something new.
Unfortunately, you're right. And as I say, the problem stems from the fact that when you create a paradigm like the Catholic Church has created with a celibate priesthood that is cannot be supported scripturally, you know, psychologically. I mean, you're putting you're setting the person up for failure. How many seminarians today are told in the seminary that when you are ordained, you will have a 50 that at any given moment in time, half of all the priests are not leading celibate lives.
Yeah.
We're not being honest with seminarians. We're not telling them that. If we were honest, we say, look, you know, remember when I was first ordained and I went on my first retreat, the chancellor of the diocese after lunch, we're going for a walk, pulls me on the side, says, Father Gomulka, now that you're ordained, I want to tell you one thing. Here's my piece of advice for you, Father. I'm wondering, is he going to say, well, make sure that I say my prayers, read my breviary, don't forget to say my prayers or, my night, whatever. You know what he says? His one piece of advice to me is, I'm just brand new. I'm just ordained now, right?
Yeah.
He says, look, when you get it on, don't do it with anybody in your parish.
Oh, dear Lord. Okay. Well, there you go.
See, he didn't know if I was straight or gay.
Yeah.
So he didn't say with a woman or a guy. He just says, when you get it on with somebody, he assumed that, at one point in time, I'm going to get it on.
Yeah.
And so if I do, though, don't mess with somebody in your own parish.
Yeah.
Do it in another place.
Keep it under your hat. So a lot of Catholics, I'll end it here. A lot of Catholics think that the resignation of a few bishops, even cardinals, or a new pope is going to change a lot. Maybe not everything, but a lot. And I don't think so because this is my argument, not yours, but that the problems in the Catholic Church, and I'm looking at it from an ex-Catholic who's now Orthodox, the problems in the Catholic Church are systemic and they're theological.
Yes,
So,
exactly. I agree totally.
oh, okay.
No, I agree. No, I agree that, as I said, we have a systemic problem, and a lot of it, goes back, to the 12th century when they were trying, to address the problem of pederasty and so forth, and thinking that if they, imposed, the celibacy, that would solve the problems. But again, if that were the case, why tonight are half the priests in the world carrying on relationships with other people?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank, thank you. Thank you, Gene. I appreciate it.
It's a real pleasure being on your program, Joseph. God bless you and
Yep.
keep up the good work.
I'm trying. Thank you. God bless you too.